shut down international commerce there and trap their neighbors, the Gulf countries, and deny oil to the world. Now, as long as that's the case, Trump is very vulnerable to criticism, and it's justifiable criticism, of course, which is why he's vulnerable to it. He's got to deal with that. So that's one issue. The other is the deep file, which, again, there's the question of what Iran does with the 900 pounds, about 450 kg of highly enriched uranium that they still possess somewhere somehow, and also the future of their enrichment program. So they're going to have to agree ultimately to hand over to somebody. And it might have been Russia, but the Ukraine war has changed that. So I think with U.S. oversight or the U.S. itself or something, they're going to have to give that stuff up and agree to not enrich beyond the very low levels required for electricity production with oversight. If they do that, they probably get a deal. But I don't think Trump can go much further unless Iran makes an agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So the most up scenario, some sort of an agreement before the end of next week that the strait will be opened, at least temporarily, in order to make way for further talks where they try to see if they can make a deal based on time. So that something like the Obama deal, where Obama got Iran to agree any further for 10 to 12 years and give their enriched uranium. So in this case, it would be probably Trump would demand more than 12 years, maybe 20 or something. And the material would go to Pakistan with American oversight or to the U.S. or something like that. Maybe even there's a third party, not Russia and not these other countries. So we would, that's possible. But I don't think it happen. I think what's more likely is that ultimately this war turns into a prolonged stalemate, which the Israelis call mowing the grass, where you have U.S. and or Israel repeatedly bombing Iran from time to time, and then Iran responding, and the whole thing turning into a protracted standoff, like the U.S. had with Iraq in the 90s, and the Israelis have with Hezbollah and Hamas in Lebanon and Gaza.
Now, Hussein, I want to... that the U.S. is considering a $20 billion cash deal for the uranium. How credible do you think that is? And if it turns out to be credible, isn't it worse than the one the Obama administration made with Tehran, the one you mentioned?
No, I think it's very similar, because what you're talking about here is not a cash payment from the United States to Iran. I think that's how critics, frame it, but that's not what's being apparently discussed. What they're talking about is unfreezing $20 billion of Iranian assets that are frozen elsewhere. In other words, allowing them to access their own money that has been withheld from them because of sanctions. And I think it's not worse. It's actually very similar to what happened in the Obama era, where similarly frozen Iranian assets were unfrozen as an inducement for Iran to make a deal. At that time, Republicans and right-wingers and all that started screaming about pallets of cash. They sounded like parrots, pallets of cash. It was absurd. But it doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. That was a political stance. And again, I think people could criticize Trump for that if he did it, but it makes perfect sense. Like, what kind of inducement are you going to give Iran to hand over this material? Just stopping bombing is probably not enough. I think offering them access to their own money that eventually they're going to end up getting somewhere or another is a very reasonable thing to do. And I don't think it's worse at all than what Obama did. I think it's very similar. And if Trump makes a deal, it's going to be very similar to the deal that Obama got, because that's all that's available to the U.S. and Iran. And Trump was wrong that was the worst deal ever, and he was wrong to go out of it. And the whole thing has been a fiasco. But getting back to that same kind of an arrangement is a good idea. It just shouldn't have taken all this time and death and money and bombing and all that to get back to where we were when Trump first came into the White House. But, there you go.
Now, Hussein, there was a
They're also torn. Let's listen to what Bulgarians have to say.
The desire to change the course of Bulgaria led me to the box and seek change for the better, for progress, for independence. Why hasn't this happened in the 8 elections so far? In Bulgaria there's mafia, and the mafia has the state, so I want to put an end to this.
The European states, the Asian powers, who are basically the customers for a lot of this energy that should be coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, Qatari LNG and petroleum from countries like Iraq and Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain and to some extent Saudi Arabia, though they have a pipeline that goes in the opposite direction. But certainly Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait and the others are cut off. And so what you end up with then is an international interest in reopening the strait and maintaining the freedom of navigation there. Iranian attempt to make the Strait of Hormuz de facto Iranian territorial waters is an affront to international interests, global interests, and to commerce. So the problem is that European states that opposed this war, and they were right to do it, but still, and who've been bullied by Trump, are loath to come in and kind of back him up on this. But I think ultimately the international community, including the Asian countries and the European countries, the customers of the Gulf countries, have a real interest and an obligation ultimately to help ensure freedom of navigation here. So it is necessary that once the strait is reopened, there is an international consortium that can dispatch ships to the waters of the Gulf, at least for a period of a decade or two, to ensure that Iran doesn't try this again, and to protect shipping and to maintain order in the Strait of Hormuz. This should not be an American mission for multiple reasons. It should be a global mission. And European states are ideally suited to lead this. It would not be war with Iran. It would be essentially peacekeeping on the high seas. And I think European states and East and South Asian states are in a position to do that, and they need to do it. It would be a very responsible thing for them to do, and it shouldn't be framed as entering the conflict on behalf of the United States. And in fact, it won't happen until the conflict is over. But once the conflict is over, I do think the international community, including Europe and Asia, need to act to ensure that Iran doesn't try to pull this stuff again.
Yes. Hussein, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. It's always
6 years by some European intelligence service, not Russian, not American. The content of the wiretap phone conversations was provided by this service to some journalists from several EU countries, and soon representatives of the EU establishment this content against Orban. It was interference in the Hungarian elections.
Newly elected Hungary. Who is leading in the polls for the country's parliamentary election, laid out his goals for the vote, the country's 8th in 5 years.
Of course, we will do everything possible for Bulgaria to have a regular, stable, effective government, because in the crisis we are currently in, we must not allow to new elections. This is not the solution.
An admirer. Former Prime Minister Boyko Borisov, who himself was arrested and released over allegations of extortion. Borisov has voiced skepticism of Radev's promises of change.
Of state for 10 years, and he says he's the new, the head of state is the new. I haven't been anything but an MP for 6 years. And I am the old, while he's the new one with all the oligarchs.
The snap vote comes after the resignation of a Conservative-led government amid large-scale anti-corruption demonstrations in December.
Of asylum seekers to ensuring academic freedom.
20
will attempt a controlled landing on a barge. This marks a key step in Bezos' space ambitions, competing with SpaceX for future lunar missions under NASA's Artemis program.
The EU has been somewhat inaudible on Iran with all their rhetorical gymnastics about Israel's need for self-defense and how they're not big fans of the mullahs. So maybe Bibi just doesn't think they care too much about being impressed by him on Iran and how he's dealing with Iran. How about Lebanon, though, which doesn't have the same baggage for the EU?
The war continues, including within the security zone in Lebanon, where I was just a short while ago. We have neutralized the threat of an invasion from Lebanon through this security zone. We are also pushing back and addressing the danger of anti-tank fire. We have done tremendous work and achieved great success, but there is more to do, and we are doing it. We have effectively changed the face of the Middle East. Our enemies, Iran and the axis of evil, came to destroy us, and now they are simply fighting for their survival.
Okay, so doesn't seem like Bibi cares too much what the EU thinks about his bombing of the EU's pal Lebanon either. Well, how about the US? Surely they can't just do whatever they want in their own sovereign interests, right? The same interests that the EU keeps calling their shared Western values.
We will ensure that they are being held accountable to their word, and if they are not, the president has laid out the if they don't hold true to the words that we are hearing privately behind the scenes. When the president says more reasonable, again, these folks are appearing more reasonable behind the scenes privately in these conversations than perhaps some of the previous leaders who are now no longer on planet Earth because they lied to the United States.
Summary execution without a trial for lying is certainly a new Western value, I guess. Brussels is messing around with the window dressing in the Hungarian legal system when the U.S. is admitting to just straight up killing foreign leaders as a technique, I guess, to break.
Of sorties, refuelings, and strikes carried out under the protection of divine providence. A massive effort with miraculous protection. Dude 44 Bravo spoke for all of us. God is good.
Okay, so holy war is apparently the latest Western value. Maybe the EU can try sending them the same 27-point checklist that they just sent to Magyar and see how Team Trump responds to it. Or, hear me out here, it sounded crazy, I know, but maybe they can just let Hungary try following the comparatively reasonable agenda that its people actually voted for without turning every single budget line into an obstacle course.
That's enough.
coalitions in southern
roller coaster of a week. Earlier this week, there were signs of optimism, signs that Tehran and Washington were making progress on the diplomatic front, especially with a disagreement over the Strait of Hormuz. Remember, on Friday, Foreign Minister Abbas Araqchi came out and officially announced the Strait of Hormuz was once again open for vessels in line with the ceasefire agreement if those vessels got permission from Iranian authorities. However, yesterday, the Revolutionary Guard released a statement that once again restrictions have been put in place for the Hormuz, blocking all vessels. The Revolutionary Guard saying they made the move because Washington had violated the ceasefire agreement. Washington had failed to remove its own U.S. naval blockade, keeping ships from going to and from Iranian ports. Reports also that Iranian forces had fired on a number of vessels 24 hours to keep them away from the Strait of Hormuz. These developments speak to a number of things. First off, it's clear that Tehran is willing to still use the Strait of Hormuz as an economic lever to apply pressure to the U.S. And it also speaks to the economic dimension of this war that's still very active. Remember, the Strait of Hormuz, a critical waterway in the Persian Gulf through which 20% of the world's oil travels through. When the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran on February 28th, Iran essentially shut down the Strait of Hormuz and applied pressure on the U.S. Now we see we're back to where we were during the war in Iran, saying that unless Washington keeps its agreement, keeps its promises in the Strait of in the ceasefire agreement, the Strait of Hormuz will be blocked. So once again, uncertainty on the diplomatic front as we wait to see if these second rounds of talks are going to happen.
staff, so I understand, Shirley, you have some figures you're going to walk us.
So yes, about a third of the fertilizers used in the world come from that region, from Gulf states, from Iran. Iran actually is the fourth largest producer and exporter of urea, which is the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer. And these images, this map, shows with these various dots sites where fertilizers are being produced and exported across the world. And currently, actually, they can't, as the strait is blocked. Very few ships go through it. We've talked about it again and again. And this is a problem not because of just of the proportion and the numbers of fertilizers usually exported from that area, but also
even when fertilizers are made elsewhere, they use gas, and gas also comes, largely from that area of the world, and this means there are going to be maybe shortages, there may be inflation to come, it's highly likely, and also food uncertainty. We know that all these fertilizers have allowed in the past 15 years to increase so much yield across the world and help so many people lessen food insecurity. Well, now we're seeing this in reverse, and there's a great concern to see things getting worse. For example, the IMF said that, well, in sub-Saharan Africa, there could be 20 million people pushed towards hunger, according to that organization. Various figures of this sort, so yes, a lot of concern.
Now, Shirley.
See a map showing countries most largely affected, and some countries produce. I mean, for example, in Europe, we're not directly affected because we don't import fertilizers from Gulf states. But still, when there's less of something, then prices globally increase. So yes, fertilizers, there have been less of them in Europe, and their prices are increasing, and this continues. But other countries, for example, have been exporting a lot of farming goods, a lot of crops. For example, Australia, and we can see various areas. India uses a lot of fertilizers from Gulf states, Pakistan also largely. But we're also thinking about countries, for example, like Sudan. Almost half, even actually more than half of the fertilizers that Sudanese farmers use come from Gulf states, and that's a major problem because they're already facing not only food insecurity but also hunger and famine in some areas of the country. So they need to find solutions fast, and this also comes as we know that aid is not coming in as much as it used to. Various countries, the U.S., also here in Europe, they've cut down aid to countries which are suffering from food insecurity. It really depends where we are. They need to act fast because, everything's happening now in this season. And what they're doing globally is that they're shifting away from crops that need a lot of fertilizers. So they're shifting away. For example, they're dropping rice, they're dropping corn, they're turning towards sunflowers, they're turning towards barley. I mean, really thinking this very fast because they know that the fertilizers are not coming. So we see here in France, for example, farmers are saying it's just too expensive to grow corn now with the price of fertilizers, the price of fuel, so they're just turning to sunflower, turning to soybeans in other areas, for example, in the U.S., shifting away from cotton as well. So yes, a lot of decisions have to be made very fast, and also a lot of deals. We've been seeing countries like Australia trying to, reach deals with countries that sell fertilizers and trying to reach that deal to get the fertilizers to them and not to the competition. So a lot of competing and battling to get those fertilizers in weeks to come.
Forces and Hezbollah militants. Meanwhile, the leader of Hezbollah says the truce cannot be one-sided and has vowed to respond to Israeli attacks. Let's listen now to some of the Lebanese people who've been displaced by the fighting.
I retired on February 28th and opened a small shop at a grocery store to work in and spend my time. Then the war broke out on March 1st and nothing was left of the shop.
Don't know what will happen. I don't know if I should repair my shop or if the bombings will start again. I came to see for myself. I'll wait 10 days, and if the truce holds, I'll repair it.
watched closely as a potential new bridge between the Kremlin and Europe. Charlotte Hughes explains.
In the central Bulgarian city of Veliko Tarnovo, Rumen Radev, who is leading in the polls for the country's parliamentary election, laid out his goals for the vote, the country's 8th in 5 years.
Of course, we will do everything possible for Bulgaria to have a regular, stable, effective government.